Before we get into today's video, please quickly check below to see if you've subscribed. It's totally free and allows you to never miss one of our videos. The light cruiser Orion's bow sliced through space like an arrow fired from its namesake, or like a blade. Human vessels were named after weapons, primarily swords. The bow was a Xiphos-class warship, colloquially referred to as a habship, due to its ability to be self-sustaining. Life aboard a habship wasn't exactly pleasant, but it was constant. Xiphos ships were intended for long-term voyages, where resupply would be spotty at best. The Orion's bow was long, shallow, and narrow, a sword in shape as well as class, designed to minimize its targetable silhouette while on offense. The bridge was abuzz with activity, the gentle blue lights helping illuminate the numerous human officers in the navy blue uniforms of the Human Commonwealth Space Exploration Force. Seated at the center of the bridge was Captain Trent Riley. Tall even for a human, Riley was lanky but broad-shouldered, sporting short cropped black hair and a smattering of stubble around his mouth and jaw. His blue eyes narrowed. This had initially been intended as a sort of shakedown mission to acclimate the new crew to the Orion's bow, and the crew overall to a new methodology. Of course, nothing was ever that easy. It was now the only vessel in the area with any chance to stop misuse of a powerful new shield generator, meaning that a routine mission now carried very real risk to life and limb. Ever since humanity's explosive emergence into the galactic community, they were the subject of rumor, fear, and no small amount of illegal wagers. The discovery that they evolved on what qualified as a death world, and one of the most terrifying ones, already had the galaxy's civilians at large nervous about the tall mammals. Their military victories, particularly that of a new spacefaring race fighting the Dithrian Federation to a standstill, set tongues wagging and mandibles vibrating in various intelligence organizations. Ultimately, it was decided that the best way to help acclimate the galaxy to their new neighbors would be an exchange program of sorts. Humans' versatility allowed them to live rather comfortably among other species, so numerous science vessels, research stations, and diplomatic entourages found a human or two seconded to them. Military ships were also prime candidates for human cooperation, and that went both ways. Human environments were far less hospitable to aliens than vice versa, meaning that the humans had to be discerning in how many aliens they allowed on their ships. Orion's bow was one of the first to collect several aliens, including a Dithrian of all things down in engineering, and an Ekeg on the bridge. Zavor was the Ekeg in question, and he cut quite the exceptional example of his species. Most of the three-eyed reptiles had beige or rust-colored scales, with a minority that were brown. Zavor was a rare, deep red Ekeg, and his rarity did not end with his coloration. All Ekegs were squat and broad, while Zavor was taller and leaner than most, albeit still sturdy. He possessed a combination of normally recessive genes that left him better suited for harsh environments, making him an ideal candidate for this exchange program. In Zavor's opinion, to use a human aphorism, he'd drawn the short straw. He could have been among his own people, admired by men and adored by women for his size, sturdiness, and exotic color. Instead, he was packed in with mammals. Zavor had spent the last 3 weeks of travel getting accommodated in the bow, learning the layout reflexively. Occasionally, he visited Megira, but the Dithrian was a strange one. Well, all Dithrians were strange in Zavor's opinion, but Megira was stranger than usual. Her parents had been refugees from the Federation, raised in Nicti space. Growing up amid those calculating, work-obsessed insects had left Megira cold and detached. Biologically, at least, Megira was a typical Dithrian. Larger than humans, the Dithrians were wingless birds with short, parrot-like beaks and close, fluffy feathers for insulation on their cold home planet. They favored either black or white colorations, with flecks of grays and browns. Zavor turned his three-eyed gaze back to the view screen, trying to focus on the mission at hand. His central eye contracted, narrowing its field of vision. This had originally been a heist, but was turning into something much worse. The southeastern fringe of the galaxy was an untamed place. Human space was at the edge of this dangerous region of planets and nebulae, and the discovery of humanity had led many mapmakers to redesign their galactic maps with the classic "here be monsters" restored in that uncharted section of space. Rebellious offshoots of the galactic community often fled to the southeast, outside of civilized control. Exotic aliens were common, pirates and warlords were frequent, and the only saving grace was that the fringe kept to the fringe. In this case, however, the fringe had indeed not kept to the fringe. "All right," Captain Riley gritted out. "Let's review what we know of the situation." Lieutenant Danica Kellen took the lead. The statuesque blonde human had initially played clutch mother to Zavor, following him around to ensure he was comfortable aboard the vessel despite his protests. Despite her odd maternal tendencies, she was a competent officer. Kellen stood and began speaking extemporaneously, which Zavor had to admit was rather impressive.
"While we were already in transit, we received communique from the hegemony of Naxviti."
The Nikti government was notoriously loath to involve outsiders in its problems, but haste was the essence in this situation.
"One of their science divisions was showcasing a proof of concept, a new variety of shield generator touted to be impenetrable. The transit convoy was intercepted by a ramshackle collection of pirate ships, which somehow managed to board and steal the generator. The Nikti lost track of them in a nebula, but wanted us to begin a search. They advised that the generator gave off a specific energy signature, so if the pirates were experimenting with it, we could follow it straight to them."
Which is where things get complicated. Riley picked up where she left off. Once the generator kicked on, it hasn't turned off, which means it's plugged in and active. This prototype generator only projects a field large enough to cover a cargo container, but that's still plenty of real estate to be under a shield. Zavor spoke up, the petty officer's voice a low growl. "Mission priorities, Captain." Riley looked over at him. "Priority 1 is to ensure the generator's schematics don't fall into enemy hands. Since it's been constantly active, they might not have tried to dismantle or understand it. That gives me some hope that they don't have the data just sitting around. In which case, we just need to capture or eliminate all of the pirates. Priority 2 is the retrieval of the generator, but that can be overruled by Priority 1 if necessary. While it would be a loss of resources, destroying the generator to prevent its proliferation is permissible." An ensign raised his voice.
"Do we have any idea as to who took the shield generator in the first place?"
Kellen offered the answer.
"According to the few captives the Nikti were able to take and interrogate, they're called the Children of Waran, some sort of Asav cult."
She noticed Zavor's visceral shudder.
"Do you have something to add to this, petty officer?"
Zavor blinked all three eyes from left to right, feeling rather like a Bazan in the spotlight. Yes. Waran's Memorial was the first planet to get the designation of Death World. A group calling themselves Waran's Children would have to be some sort of maniacs, probably obsessed with death and destruction. Captain Riley stood, smoothing out his uniform. "Helmsman, take us in as close as is feasible. Maintain silent running. I want to collect as much information as we can. Orbit and see what we can collect from outgoing transmissions." He turned to Zavor. "Petty Officer Zavor, please accompany me to my office." Zavor rose and followed, worried that he might have acted in error at some point. Riley stalked through the halls like a predator, clearly on edge. He leaned forward, as if ready to lunge at any target that suddenly rounded the corner. The captain's office was well appointed, although most of that was generic. The large desk was designed to resemble wood, though Zavor still didn't quite understand why. Heavy green curtains hung from the walls, despite there being no windows. One of the only aspects of personalization was a plaque upon which rested an archaic human rifle. The thing was mostly black, somewhat blocky, with a pale wooden stock. To be honest, it looked a mess to Zavor's eyes. Riley didn't bother to sit behind his desk. He leaned one hand on it, gaze wandering between the Ekeg's 3 eyes. I wanted to go over this without you feeling called out in public, Zavor. This will be your first mission with us, a human crew, and with me as your commanding officer. I want to make certain that you're willing to follow my orders without question in the moment. I understand that I'm likely to command quite differently from the Ekegs, but hesitation can be the difference between life and death.
Zavor inclined his head to the right in confirmation.
You're right that I don't know your command style, sir, but I don't need to know how you operate. As long as I can understand your orders, I can follow them. And if I may be so bold, perhaps if we have time, I could offer my opinion on the situation sometimes. After all, an Ekeg's perspective on the situation might be different and could give you new ideas.
Riley smiled. Just don't hold a grudge if I shoot down your ideas, all right? Humans really did smile so much. Even other mammals like Asav didn't bare their teeth so often. For Ekegs, their snubbed snouts didn't let them show their teeth unless it was time to bite.
Unrelated, Captain, but I do wonder.
Zavor gestured at the mounted weapon.
What sort of gun is that? It looks ancient.
Riley looked over his shoulder at the rifle and chuckled.
That's a family souvenir. One of my ancestors, great-grandfather or great-great, scavenged it during guerrilla actions in one of Earth's wars. It's called a VSS Ventores. Due to laws at the time, it couldn't be used by a civilian, so it sort of became tradition to just maintain it. The thing still shoots, if you can believe it.
Zavor's middle eye dilated slightly in what was his people's equivalent to a raised eyebrow.
Interesting.
The idea of such a primitive projectile weapon, one that could only fire at about the speed of sound, was absurd to him when humanity had smoothly adopted the energy rifles commonplace through the rest of the galaxy. Before Riley could wax further on his weapon, his communicator beeped. Plucking the device from his waist and flicking it open, Trent Riley was faced with his communications officer. The dark-haired woman looked frazzled.
Captain, we've received another missive, this time from the Ekeg conglomerate.
That had Zavor's full attention. Riley ushered him out of the office.
I'm on my way back to the bridge, Lieutenant. Bring me up to speed.
She nodded.
The children of Waran have attacked an Ekeg pleasure cruiser. They took several dozen captives and passed through the nebula, heading in this direction. Shockwaves indicate that the pirate ships have arrived at the edge of the star's gravity well and should be headed for this very planet.
Riley quickened his pace.
Tell the helmsman to pull back a safer distance. We don't want to be found out before we figure out what they're doing.
Well, sir...
The communications officer's voice briefly resonated in double as Riley entered the bridge before he cut the transmission.
We also know that this planet has a molten core.
That brought the captain up short.
So, we have a cult named after the first designated death world, set up on a death world. Damn it. Do we know how many pirate ships are incoming?
3, sir,
she replied. Riley sank heavily into his seat.
I all but guarantee those civilians are intended to be some kind of sacrifices, and the shield generator is there to ensure they're not interrupted.
He slammed his fist into the side of the console next to him.
We can't let them bring the hostages planetside. All right, new plan. Kellen, Zavor, pick some Marines you think capable of handling the situation. We're going down in a lander. Commander McBride.
He whirled and pointed at a red-haired man with a thick beard.
You're in charge shipside. Intercept those pirate craft, board them, and rescue the hostages.
McBride looked scandalized.
But, Captain, what will you even be doing planetside?
Riley's smile in return was all teeth.
At the very least, assessing the situation and providing advance reconnaissance. If we're lucky, we can cut the head off the snake. Just be careful, the red-haired man admonished. A snake's head can still bite, and all the venom's up there, Captain.
Riley answered him with a grim grin. Clad in full vacuum-sealed combat armor, Captain Riley, Lieutenant Kellen, Petty Officer Zavor, and 6 Marines piled into a landing craft to stealthily infiltrate the unnamed planet under the cover of heavy clouds. Kellen had selected Marines Vilches, LaSalle, and Carver for this mission, while Zavor favored the biggest and strongest, Herbert, Laurel, and Turnbull. Zavor felt like the odd man out more than usual. Human armor was not designed for Ekeg physiology, and so all that Zavor got was a new coat of paint to match his companions. Ekeg warplate was blocky, layers of breakaway ablative armor to hopefully preserve the soldier beneath. Ekeg's blood did not clot terribly well, so a stray wound ran the risk of bleeding out. Warplate helped to solve this issue via the innermost layer being a gauze-like material to catch blood and help force a clot. By contrast, human armor was a sleek black undersuit with white plating over the top, and a white helmet with a featureless black faceplate. Each of the Marines bore a pack with additional ammunition and explosives, while Kellen was the most lightly equipped. She bore only a sidearm energy pistol, as her back was occupied with a communications array. Riley stood out the most, at least to Zavor. While he had an energy rifle magnetized to his back, he carried an enormous revolver at his hip, in contrast to the usual energy pistol. Zavor was certain that they'd all be having a much worse time if they hadn't worn sealed armor. Much of the planet was thick jungle, heavy with vines and the low keening of insect wings. Fog rolled around their ankles, while the humidity was so thick that condensation formed on Zavor's visor and the human's faceplates. Knowing that Orion's bow's presence would soon enough be revealed, Riley had McBride wait about 20 minutes after deployment to perform an active scan of the planet. The global ping would expose the ship, but they'd be visible the moment they went onto intercept course. The data streamed onto Kellen's communications suite, the tall woman double-checking her information.
All right, we were correct that our target is some 5 miles northeast. The shield generator distorts some of the scan data, but it's a small and rather ramshackle complex. Rough prefabs, the kind of thing you get on discount from storage, likely dating back to the last colony rush.
To the humans, this was a simple statement. They hadn't grown up with the knowledge of the horrors that the Death World had brought. For Zavor, it was part of his life, a nightmare that haunted many children, the fear that their planet's core would suddenly melt and ash would drown their world.
I like this less and less,
Zavor spoke in his deep growl. Several faceplates turned toward him, forcing the Ekeg to justify his statement.
A cult named after Warren's memorial, the first recorded Death World, he enumerated. Prefabricated shelters from the last colony rush, which came to a halt when the dangers of Death Worlds were discovered. And this planet is itself a Death World, a molten core, and...
He struggled for the word, unfamiliar to his people.
Volcanic activity. Whatever they have planned, it involves this planet intimately.
One of the Marines spoke up, his voice gruff.
All this jungle, a cult, the talk of death, makes me think of the Aztecs, Cap.
Riley made a strange noise behind his faceplate, sucking saliva through his teeth.
I'd hoped I was stretching when I made the association myself.
Realizing that Zavor was probably lost, he turned toward his alien subordinate.
Old human culture. They had a religion that revolved around sacrificing live humans, enemies and slaves, when they could get them. They believed those deaths appeased their gods or something.
The Aztecs also lived in thick jungle. The Marine who'd spoken, whom Zavor's heads-up display identified as Vilches, nodded.
Too much coincidence. I don't like it one bit.
Riley gave a single decisive bob of his head.
Then we'd better double time it. Keep low. It's getting late, so that'll give us some cover. But we don't know how long the night lasts on this planet.
Kellen kept a line to Orion's bow, feeding the ground team occasional updates. The cruiser was engaging the pirate ships, carrying out boarding actions to rescue the Ekeg captives. Communication slowed, but no news is good news. The cruiser would not be beaten by some piratical maniacs. The team reached the edge of the rainforest, and Laurel withdrew a set of binoculars, synchronizing them with his helmet.
Well, they sure ain't subtle,
he chuckled. The shield generator created a coruscating dome in the center of the settlement, the surface rippling like oil over water. It was hard to determine just what was inside, but it looked like some sort of small tiered structure. The comparisons to the Aztecs only felt stronger. Now the aliens had their own miniature pyramid. Scattered around the cult's headquarters were large braziers, whatever junk they used for fuel producing more cloying black smoke than heat or light. The soldiers themselves were patchwork, which was in itself an achievement. Prefabricated living spaces were intended to be plug-and-play, but these looked as though someone had several different prefabs of the same model, all of them incomplete, and just mashed them together to hope for the best. Various Asav milled around, dozens of the blue-skinned aliens who rather closely resembled the little green men of science fiction. Each one was armed with a rifle and wore ramshackle armor forged from different suits. Some of the bigger men even carried scraps of ship plating on their backs. The commonality was that each one wore a scarf or other accessory branded with the yellow silhouette of a hand, a bloody handprint. Thick ropes of wiring spread out overhead, connecting one shelter to the next like sinew, feeding power to small lights and large speakers. A warbling noise, somewhat like music, rose up from the cult settlement, though translation software failed to parse it. Turnbull looked down at Zavor.
"What are they saying?"
the broad man asked. Zavor twisted his head to the left and touched his chin to his shoulder, the Ekeg equivalent of a shrug.
"I think it's Asav hymnals, but they usually worship in an old language. Most translation packages don't include it."
Like Gaelic Mass, Captain Riley chuckled mirthlessly at the comparison. "All right, fan out. Keep to the jungle for cover. Stay within headset contact. I want to get angles on this place. Find something unguarded and let's see what we can do." Headset contact, as the captain called it, was an unofficial term that most in the Commonwealth military understood. Their helmets had advanced communication suites allowing for transmission over miles, but greater distance demanded higher power output and thereby a higher chance of detection by anyone trawling for signals. Headset contact, as it came to be known, meant the lowest output, still a significant distance, but a far cry from the miles that could be transmitted. Eventually, Danica Kellen's voice came through their helmets, her usual chirp soft and breathy with tension. She was overall a gentlewoman, and Zavor thought her ill-suited for warfare, but could not exactly question his commanding officer's choice of staff.
"I've got an angle. Haven't seen any of the guards come around this side of the prefab, and the wires hang low. I should be able to splice something."
Riley's grin could be heard over the radio, and it was all teeth.
"All right, Zavor, back up Kellen. Keep her covered. Marines, you head to the eastern crescent and prepare for assault. You'll know when it happens."
He settled onto one knee, getting into a relatively comfortable shooting position.
"I'm on overwatch."
Keeping low, Kellen and Zavor crawled to the location she'd denoted. Ekegs had an easier time moving on all fours, so he had to routinely make sure he wasn't leaving his human companion behind. Plus, the long-range comms gear on her back was guaranteed to slow her down. Once they reached their target, Kellen smoothly rose to a standing position, carried by her long legs in a display of finesse and flexibility that Zavor envied. Just when he'd been feeling a little smug about his quadrupedal speed, she had to remind him that his people simply couldn't bend like that. As if it had been choreographed and practiced, she released the magnetic tether from her pack and lowered it to the ground with a gentle thud, opening a section to retrieve a multi-tool and 2 lengths of wire. Beside her, Zavor walked his hands up the wall to help him stand without having to awkwardly push himself up, then plastered himself to the wall as best he could.
"Keep me covered,"
Kellen whispered, her voice resonating in Zavor's helmet. The Ekeg compulsively scanned the area, head on a swivel and all 3 eyes wide for threats. The human woman began to gently saw into the bundle of wires dangling from the side of the prefabricated building. Or perhaps refabricated might be more appropriate, considering that the shelters had clearly been broken and rebuilt, before folding the serrated blade back into her multi-tool and withdrawing a small pointed probe. She poked the probe into the bundle of wires several times, clicking her tongue in distaste when the solution did not immediately reveal itself. Finally, however, the blonde gave a fist pump of triumph. She quickly holstered the multi-tool and brought up the wires from her comms pack, beginning to splice them into some of the wires within the bundle.
"While I do this," Kellen continued, "I need you to open up the lower panel. It's basically a tablet, so it should be easy to navigate. Pull up Danny's workout playlist, crank the volume to max, and be ready to hit play on my order."
The rest of the squad heard Kellen's voice in their ears, a sharp hiss of urgency.
"Hit play! Go, go, go!"
Not bothering to guess what hit play meant, the Marines knew it was time to attack, and their unspoken question was answered less than a second after the command was given. The gently warbling Assav prayer hymnals gave way to the roar of guitar, drums, and bass, with nearly unintelligible human bellowing from a ragged throat. The death metal blared out of the speakers at such a volume that the shelters rattled and the nearby jungle swayed. The Assav cultists were caught off guard, screaming and clutching their pointed ears as they tried to comprehend what was happening. LaSalle, the Marine in the lead, was the one to give the orders. "Strobes!" he shouted, and his squadmates followed his command. Panels on the human's armor slid open to reveal LEDs which arrhythmically pulsed with retina-searing white light. Their own faceplates filtered out the worst of the light, but the Assav were not so lucky. Psychological warfare was a long-standing human tactic. Give your enemy no chance to face the battle without catastrophic overstimulation. If he can't hear and can't see, odds are he can't think either. Some of the cultists managed to react, pulling on helmets that weren't quite enough to mute the cataclysmic noise, but at least buffered the blinding light. Others were too slow or unlucky to not have helmets with them. Even those who did protect themselves only managed to do so by sacrificing vital response time. The Marines charged up a short alleyway between 2 shelters before fanning out to ensure their strobes would do more harm to the enemy's senses. The searing indigo of energy rifle fire pierced through the camp, leaving actinic afterimages carved into the thick jungle air. Many of the Assav guards were still staggered, making them easy targets. A good number of them gathered naturally around a makeshift fountain built from scrap and an old water pump. The cultists' pirate armor certainly proved helpful, as it took at least a few shots from the advancing Marines, but even a well-armored immobile target will eventually drop. Even for an experienced combatant, headshots were difficult in the heat of battle, and it was usually better to go for 2 or 3 body shots, keeping the target staggered, than to miss a few and potentially hit something unintended. Of course, this didn't take into account Captain Riley. From the jungle's edge, he looked through his rifle's telescopic sight and took the shots offered him. Indigo light seared into the blue skull, and another Assav dropped dead to the ground. The Marines and their captain cut down about a dozen Assav in the opening salvos, but there were at least 20 more, the survivors pulling back toward the shield generator in a disorganized fighting retreat. Unfortunately, This wasn't the total rout that Riley and his men might have hoped for. The Asav fired maniacally in return, still rattled from the noise. Even the helmeted fighters were blinking away spots from the strobes, but they were experienced killers. Wild shots found their mark more often than not, and the Marines had to move into cover rather than press the advantage. Herbert tried to continue the assault head-on, barreling straight toward the cultists while roaring in a desperate attempt to be heard over the world-shaking music, hoping that his sheer mass and the constant report of his rifle would break enemy morale. Several shots caught him in the chest and torso, then an impact to the knee made his leg buckle. Kneeling on the ground, the big man took 1, 2, 3 shots to the head. His enormous body crashed over like a collapsing pillar and moved no more. Riley met up with Kellen and Zavor, giving the order to cut the music. The sudden silence would be nearly as jarring as the death metal before it. This was fortuitous, for it afforded them the chance to hear the scream as an Asav backed into the shimmering shield. Zavor stuck his head out to sea and wished he hadn't. The Asav was essentially unspooled, his body torn apart into constituent molecules by the coruscating colors before the remainder erupted into ash. A deep voice boomed from within the shield.
"Stand firm, children of Warren!"
Asav did not tend to have booming voices like that, but vocal cord surgery was unfortunately common with the freaks of the galaxy. Riley switched his helmet for public transmission.
"Counterpoint,"
he bellowed, his voice naturally baritone.
"You drop your weapons and surrender, and maybe you get leniency for being out of your damn minds."
Seeing their dead arrayed behind the advancing humans, more than a few of the remaining Asav hesitated before their comrades' presence clearly intimidated them into a refusal to surrender. The moment the first of the hesitants straightened his back and shoulders, Riley bored a hole through the Asav's forehead. Turnbull barked a laugh as the humans took cover again under a hail of energy fire. Zavor looked at the man, considering that he might be nearly as mad as the cultists here. Once again on closed communications, Riley gave the order.
"Pop E-smoke."
The 5 remaining Marines quickly retrieved small red spheres about the size of a human fist, hurling them into the fray. The grenades burst into powdery red smoke, obscuring vision. This smoke was specially designed, however. Human heads-up displays, including Zavor's, could still target through it. The Asav opened fire on where the humans had been, but the Marines were already moving to flank. It was a slaughter, every lost cultist dropping in less than a minute. When the smoke cleared, the humans could finally see the cult's leader, at least to some degree. Targeting systems failed to register through the shield, and the rippling colors made it difficult to get a good look at him. But the leader was a tallish Asav who looked properly crazed. His eyes were wide and sunken, the usual folds around them non-existent. Zavor couldn't say whether it was simple madness or if the maniac had had them surgically removed. Asav typically had numerous heavy folds of skin across their lanky bodies and large heads, leading many humans to compare them to something called a Shar-Pei. This one's blue skin was far tighter, and the normally bioluminescent yellow eyes blazed as if they were spotlights.
"Fools!"
the cult leader boomed, proving that he had most definitely received vocal cord surgery.
"Every action you have taken here has been by my design. The bloodshed is part of the sacrifice needed to heal."
Zavor's voice was low in Riley's ear.
"Keep him talking, Captain. There's someone else there, lying on the dais. I can't make it out through the colors yet."
The Ekeg's 3 eyes and wider visual spectrum were proving helpful. Riley didn't acknowledge Zavor, but he subsequently raised his voice. "Sacrifice?" he asked with an inquisitive inflection. "What do you mean it's needed to heal?" The Asav leader chuckled.
"Ah, and there is the source of doctrinal disagreement,"
he responded casually, gesturing with one hand. Zavor realized it was holding a large and decorative knife.
Some believed it was your destiny to guide us to healing. Others said you were merely a sign that such primitive and primal Deathworld dregs could not be our salvation. If you do not understand, then I suppose we have our answer on that front.
The cultist spread both arms wide.
Your planet kills you, yet allows you to tame it. By your bloodshed, you appease your world. We have had it wrong from the start. The living worlds do not kill indiscriminately. They take their due when it is not offered.
The shield's oil rainbow patterns finally separated in front of Zavor's eyes, and he felt his spine shudder.
Captain, it's a human. He has a human strapped down there.
Riley fired reflexively. His shot was perfectly on target, aimed directly for the Asav's eye socket, but the energy beam splashed harmlessly off the shield. The Marines followed suit, hoping to overtax the shield, but to no avail. Clutching the rifle's front grip in his left hand, Riley reached down and drew his revolver. The enormous beast of a handgun barked like a hellhound, and the bullet seemed to press into the shield before bouncing back harmlessly, as if it had been a marble thrown against rubber. The cult leader grinned.
You are the architects of your own defeat. Talk of your primitive projectile weaponry and its continued effectiveness inspired the Nicti to include defenses against it.
Turnbull grunted, scooped up a rock, and hurled it, forcing the Asav to step aside as the stone sailed past his head. Riley, coming out from his overwatch position, grabbed Kellen and pulled her back from the shield, beginning to walk away. The Asav cackled.
Yes, wallow in your defeat, but do not despair. Soon you will see the truth, when we are called to guide the galaxy into a new age of life and prosperity. What these fools call death worlds are living worlds which crave life to continue on.
He began chanting in the unintelligible religious language. Zavor couldn't make out all of Riley's conversation, but he didn't seem to be talking to Kellen, making use of her communications pack then.
Just stuff it in a backpack, shove it in a pod. I need it here yesterday, the captain ordered. Launch on the comms pack's position.
Kellen set the pack down, and both she and Riley stepped well clear of it. The captain spoke over the squad's closed channel.
Always hope your captor is evil or a madman, he paraphrased, in which case he'll waste time pontificating and bragging, going through the motions of his victory.
An escape pod came screaming through the atmosphere, red-hot from entry speeds far exceeding safe tolerances, and impacted with an oddly sedate whump into the soil. Riley tore the door from the pod and pulled out an insulated backpack, from which he withdrew the gun that had been mounted on his wall, the VSS Ventores. Checking to make sure the weapon was in working condition, Riley finished his mangled quote.
A good man will just kill you and call it a day.
He turned around, lined up a shot through the scope, and squeezed the trigger. A single sharp tick was all the sound the gun made as the subsonic bullet left the barrel, streaking through the air and punching through the Asav cultist's right eye. Yellow blood blossomed from the back of his head, the cultist's body locking up in brief bodily shock of nerves exploding with the detonation of their brain. The madman's face was frozen in utter confusion as he crashed to the ground. Danica Kellen let out a heavy breath.
Good job, Captain. How did you know it would work?
Riley shrugged.
Turnbull, hulking that rock past the shield, told me that slow-moving things could still make it through. Was a total gamble that a subsonic bullet would, too.
Zavor looked at the shield, still shimmering in place.
So, how do we turn off the shield?
The captain hefted his ballistic rifle.
Well, I've got 2 more magazines.
I hope you enjoyed that story. Click right here to watch another video with the same characters.